welcome to the Jesus Movement Live. It's a pleasure to have you join us. Tonight we are continuing on with our series, A Journey to Faith, from my book. We're on lesson 86, and tonight's title is called The Tumultuous Hasmonean Kingdom of Judea. Now, we were just speaking before we commenced tonight, and the use of the word kingdom is a little bit misconstrued. It is actually called that, but the reason is that it's actually recognised as a kingdom by the Romans at that point in time. But the fact is that for the majority of the time, they are a semi-autonomous province of the Seleucid Empire and sometimes the Ptolemaic Empire. So what that means is that they're given the freedom to govern their own affairs, but they're still under the rule of an empire that sits in above them. That usually means they have to supply soldiers and they have to pay taxes. So as we begin tonight, I'm just going to begin with a bit of background and a little bit of a recap on what we've been learning previously. So starting off, all of the teaching is based on the genealogy of Jesus. The genealogy of Jesus is found in the book of Matthew in chapter 1, and it goes from verses 1 to 17, but the portion that's attributed to after Babylonian exile is between verses 12 and 17. Now, we've been travelling in this portion for some time. We did start off with Abraham, as I said, 86 lessons ago, so that means 86 weeks prior. So it's a long journey going through the Bible with approximately 2,000 years to cover. But at this point in time, we're up to this descendant called Matthan. And Matthan is 1, 2, 3 descendants in front of Jesus. And so we find that Matthan is actually the great-grandfather of Jesus. And so Matthan is alive during the time of the Maccabees, and we have a journey which we can actually examine for Matthan, even though this is the only place he's mentioned by name in the Bible. In the book of Maccabees, we can place him in time and we can understand what was going on whilst he lived. Now, during his life, I'll just change sides here. This is Matthan on our genealogical chart, or historical genealogical chart. So this is Matthan here in the pink. He doesn't have an exact age for when he lives, so we're working on averages. Each of these descendants, after the last known dating, brings us to an average of 59 years of age for each of the descendants, which is quite a reasonable aging for those days. We've placed Matthan being born somewhere around 173 BC, and he will pass away somewhere around 114 BC. Now, at this point in this journey, we're dealing with a Judea, which is, it says here independent, but they're independent in as much as they have semi-autonomous rule, which means they are able to rule and govern their own affairs, but they are still under the rule of a foreign empire. And so throughout most of this time, we find that they're actually under the rule of the Seleucid Empire, the Greeks to the north, and hence the prophecy of Daniel talks about the kings of the north, and of course the Ptolemaic Empire, which is the kings of the south. So in this pink colour, during his life, you can see we have several people from the Maccabees family. We have Judas Maccabeus. Now, he's the first son of Matthan, who was the father of the family, who started the revolt. Then we have Jonathan Appius Maccabeus. This is the leader who we're currently walking a journey with. He has a brother called Simon Maccabeus, who actually functions in conjunction with Jonathan, which we will talk about. And Simon's son is John Hyrcanus. And so here we move into the next generation of people, and you might take notice that this name Hyrcanus is actually a Greek name, and so you see the effect of the Greek rule upon the people in Judea. So tonight we're going to be looking at the portion of the journey which goes up to the end of the life of Jonathan Appius and his circumstances. So this is a medallion, an artist's impression of what Jonathan looked like, but this has his clear name there, Jonathan Apphus Maccabees, and he is the second eldest son of Matthias of Modin, who was the rural priest who originally refused to slaughter a pig and to slaughter it for religious purposes, for the worship of a false god. And he refused to do that, and this one man stood up, and as a result of standing up, he changed the lives of everybody who came after him. Now on this map, this brings us up to where we were last week. And so the difference that's actually happened is for most of the journey now, this purpley pink colour represents the Seleucid Empire, and the yellow colour down here represents the Empire of the Ptolemies. And so, as I said, being in the south, because Jerusalem is the centre, so being in the south, the Egyptians, and the king of the Egyptians is known as the king of the south, and the ruler of the northern Seleucid Empire was based here at Antioch, and of course that is part of the new capital of the Seleucid Empire. Now what's happened last week is we see a change in what's been going on, because, and we're going to touch further on this as well, because the Egyptians are going to come up and they're going to take over all of this traditional area that's been controlled by the Seleucid Empire up to now. Now there's some names that are on here. Ptolemy VI, he's the current pharaoh or king of the Egyptian Empire. Alexander Balis is a ruler who we spoke about last week, who's residing in Antioch in the northern kingdom. And then we have this fellow Apollonius Teos, who we're going to come to, and he's actually the governor of this region, which is known as Coal Syria. And then of course we've got Jonathan Maccabees, who is the leader and the high priest of the Jewish people at this point in time. Okay, I think that's... So I'll just leave this map up behind me as we get started. Before I go into the lesson, we just want to give a little bit of an overview of what's actually happening in the Bible. So at this point in time, we are following the journey through the book of Daniel, and in chapter 11. In chapter 11, it gives you a lot of detail about what actually happens, but it also has gaps in time between each of the statements of what happens as well. And so a couple of weeks ago, we were reading quite a few scriptures, and then suddenly now we don't really have any new scriptures to read because the events are still unfolding as a consequence of that scripture. But in the book of Daniel, he specifically talks about the kings of the north and the kings of the south, and then he refines that to talk about the king of Syria. Sorry, I might just go back. The king of Syria. And the reason is because in the north, Antioch, the capital, is situated in the province of Syria. And so this completely aligns with what the prophetic word is in the book of Daniel that was given by the archangel Gabriel. Okay, so this ties all of this together. But the story of the Bible, if we have a look at it in sections, we find that there's some key areas. First of all, we started off with the patriarchs. So we started with Abraham and his son and his son's sons. From there, we find that there is a situation that happens in which Joseph is sold into slavery, but we find out that he's actually sent in advance to prepare for what is to come. When the drought hits, Joseph is put into a situation where he is basically a ruler over the Egyptian empire at the time. This is God's plan. So when the drought strikes and his family goes down, God protects his people, and we find that they grow in size immensely. Now during this time, we've gone from the people, God's people, being called Hebrews to becoming known as Israelites. And so the original word for Hebrew means from the other side. And I'm talking about, does anyone know who that reference is? The original name? No? For the word Hebrew. it says from the other side. The other side is what? Anyone remember? Who was the first person in the Bible who was called a Hebrew? Now we've got you. It was Abraham. Right, now Abraham was born in the city of Ur in southern Mesopotamia, which is in today's Iraq, and the original city of Ur was on the other side of the Euphrates River. Okay, and so he was deemed as a Hebrew because it was him who came from the other side, and so his language was actually different to those who were in the land of Canaan. So he had a distinguishing feature about himself. Now, after the story of Jacob, of course, he wrestles with the Lord through the night, and the Lord gives him a good crack in the hips, and his hips go out, and then he renames him. And his name, of course, is changed to Israel. And from that point in time, the descendants are now known as Israelites. And so, key points in the Bible, we find as we go through the journey that God calls his own people by different names according to the different events that happen. And so it's not until the people are actually in Egypt that they become known as the Israelites. When they arrived there, they were still called Hebrews because they were representative of those who spoke a language from the other side, the Euphrates River. Now, they have their time in Egypt and they prosper remarkably. They grow so much in the land of Goshen. And then what occurs? We find that the pharaohs change hands several times, and suddenly the pharaoh is threatened by the great number and the prosperity of the Jewish people, of the Israelite people. And so what does he do? He puts them into slavery. He wants to slow them down, take control of them, and use their influence and their prosperity to serve him. And so he does this until it comes to a point in time where the oppression is so great that the Israelite people cry out to leave the land of Egypt. And so this is the time where we enter into the story of the 10 plagues with the Pharaoh, when God shows his divine powers through Moses and his brother Aaron to the Egyptian people. Subsequently, they're released from slavery, and this becomes a significant event for the Jewish people and the celebration today, and for Jesus, because they celebrate Passover, the night where the blood was painted onto the lintels and the doorposts, in order that the angel of death would pass over and not kill their firstborn son. Of course, the Pharaoh's firstborn son was killed, and then we know the story that unfolds from there. Obviously, they go from there down into the land of the Sinai Peninsula, and God puts into place his covenants. So he turns his people from a people who were living in a foreign land under the worship of foreign idols, and he turns around and he says, now I'm going to set up my priesthood, those who are going to serve me, and he's going to set up the leadership for whom will represent his people. So there's that interface between the leader and the priesthood. The stage that we're at the moment, in the time of the Hasmonean dynasty, or the Maccabees, we find that each of the sons of Matthan from Matthan, the rural priest, when they receive their positions, they're called both prince and high priest, leader and high priest. So this never leaves their people, even through to where we're at the moment. Now, we won't go through the whole story, but they receive the ordinances, they meet with the Lord, and he gives them these laws, and he gives them the tabernacle, and then they head off into the desert. Of course, there's sin that's occurring, so they stay for 40 years in the desert, and only 2 people get to make it into the promised land. When they go into the promised land, God says, this is my gift for you, basically. This is the place that I promised you. And so the Israelite people, for the first time since Abraham, basically go from a homeless, nomadic tribes of people into having their own land. And so inheritance comes into place. And so the inheritance laws and the practice of the Jewish people become focused on inheritance. And so once again, when we get to the stage now where we're talking about the Maccabees, They believe that this is their land that they inherited, and so they are fighting back in order to take their inheritance back. And so tonight when we finish, we look at them achieving the boundary of their inheritance again for the first time at the northern end. So we find all this battle. We then go into the land of Israel, and we find in the descendants of Jesus that Salmon, he's the first descendant who goes into the land, and he receives the inheritance at Bethlehem. And hence we see the logging in of the details which become part of future prophecy, where we can know whom Jesus actually is. From there we go through the story of Boaz and Ruth, the descendants, and we keep passing through the descendants until we get into the time of Jesse, the father of David, and of course the story of Samuel and Samson, and we've gone through the period of Judges. Now the people, being willful people, sin, and unfortunately there's lots of problems through that period of time. And so the people decide that they want a king, somebody to rule over them here on earth. God's not very happy about this because, of course, he sees them as their king. But he acquiesces and says, okay, I'll let this happen, obviously knowing full well how it's going to go. And so the period of kings starts in the Bible, and under David and his son Solomon, we see that the kingdom of Israel is only united during those rules of those two people. But Solomon's wisdom hit such a peak and his behaviour hit such a low that as a consequence of his actions, we find that the land is to be divided into north and south, and we end up with the northern kingdom of Israel or Samaria, and we end up with the southern kingdom of Judah, which becomes Judea. When this separation happens, we find that the people to the north are taken away from the Lord by the golden calves that are placed at the north and southern boundaries at Bethel and Dan, and the people stray away from the Lord until the Assyrians come along, and the Lord uses them to punish them, and they're removed from the land altogether. And so what's left at this point in time is just the kingdom of Judah. Well, of course, the kings of Judah, they were good and they were really bad. And it comes to a point in time until the Lord takes them out of the land as well. And it's because they defile his sanctuary, they worship false gods, they commit sacrifices in other gods' names, they murder children, they set fire to the babies and the little boys in order to appease these false gods. And so God becomes absolutely angry with them. And of course their punishment was that their city was destroyed, the temple was pulled down, and they were taken off into Babylonian exile. In the period of the Babylonian exile, they obviously had some time to do some thinking, but the reality was there was hardly any people left. There was only 40, I can't remember the total numbers, but there was 40 to 50,000 people left in total. That was all that was left. And so they go through a time where the Lord tells them through the prophet Jeremiah that they are to prosper. This prosper word in Jeremiah 29:11 is the prosperity message which goes so wrong in today's modern church. And so the point of prosperity that the Lord was talking about was he wanted them to have children, because it was the children who would come back and inherit the land again. Right? It's not a message today that the Lord will bless you with everything and prosper you with material things. It's got nothing to do with that whatsoever. And so we see this journey, and when that portion of the journey happens, once again, the Lord places Daniel into the palace in Babylon, and again we have a ruler of God's people whilst they're in exile. So it happened with Joseph, now it happens with Daniel, and of course the people are returned back under the leadership of Zerubbabel, who again is one of the forefathers of Jesus. When they return back to the land, we go through this long journey where they are subjugated by foreign empires. And it's the subject of many prophecies. And so the prophecies tell us, right from the time of Nebuchadnezzar, with his statue and his original vision that he asked Daniel to interpret the dream, and it's revealed that there's going to be 4 empires that are going to come and go, and then Jesus will come. And so the first empire was Babylonia. The second empire was... Sorry, the
Greeks?
No, we're in the Greeks now. What was the Persians? Okay, so the period of the Persian empires, and then of course the Greek Empire comes in, led by Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great in Daniel's prophecies is the shaggy goat, and we find that his imagery, because he's deemed to be a god, he actually is bequeathed with a set of goat horns and ears, and the statues made in that honour. Of course, the prophecy goes on to say that his life will be short, and he does die, and he has no descendants who will rule after him. And so the Greek Empire, which was the largest of all the empires to date, grew rapidly and then went into turmoil and was separated, as the prophecy says, into 4 separate empires. So I'm not going to go through all of that again, but we've come to the time now where the empires that are at play are predominantly those from the Seleucid Empire to the north of Israel or Jerusalem, and those to the south, which is the Ptolemaic Empire, and they're in Egypt. Both of them, of course, are Hellenic societies now. They've been ruled by Greek rulers or descendants of Greek rulers, and this is the situation that arrives during the time when the Maccabees come into play, which is where we're up to now. And the Maccabees come into force because the father of a family, a rural priest from a place called Modin, which I'll just show you quickly on the map. So this place is here, called Modin. He is being coerced to sacrifice a pig to a false god in a temple. And he's the first man who stands up and resists this. As a consequence of that, he has a family full of strapping young boys, and they all decide that they're going to help their father, and they're going to revolt against these people who are forcing them to do things which is against God's will. And as a consequence of this, a battle is forged which goes for something like 126 years in total. And so we're passing through those stages of that history. First of all, the father passes away. He wasn't killed. He died of natural death. And then his son Judas Maccabeus took over from him. And he has since gone in our journey. And now his next brother, who is Jonathan Maccabeus, he is the current leader and high priest that we are following today. So last week, we got up to a point where a fellow by the name of Demetrius Nicator, who was the son of the former king of the Seleucid Empire, challenged a fellow by the name of Alexander I to claim the Seleucid throne. Now, Alexander I was actually an impostor. You might recall he was actually a person from a place called Smyrna, which is near the border of the very western side of the east side of Turkey, if that makes sense. So the channel that passes through to the Black Sea, Smyrna is just on the eastern side in today's Turkey. And so he manages to claim the Seleucid throne, and whilst that's going on, this fellow who's called Apollonius, I'll just go back to the next map. So Apollonius Theos, he's the governor of Coal Syria, and he figures that while they're busy up here, he'll sneak down and he will come down and he will deal with Jonathan and the Jewish people, and he will subjugate that territory. Unfortunately, it's a mistake that he actually makes. So when this happens, he is resoundingly beaten by Jonathan, and the battle continues from Jaffa, where it started, and goes down to what was called Azotus under the Greek name, originally Ashdod, as it's called again today. And here the people are decimated, the city is destroyed, and the Temple of Dagon, which is where a number of the people hid, it was set to fire and it was destroyed once and for all. And so Dagon, of course, was one of the false gods that we read about in the Bible, to whom was worshipped during the time of? Who? During the time of? The son of David, King Solomon. Okay, so this temple and this false god has been in play for a long time. It's coastal, so he's deemed as a fish god. It's not his origins originally, but they would worship him as a god of fish and fishing. And so this was all destroyed now during the time of Jonathan Maccabee. So Apollonius had acted without consent of Alexander. So when the king heard what happened, he gives the city of Ekron to Jonathan and honours him with a golden buckle, normally reserved for relatives. And so this is Ekron here. Now Ekron's a former Philistine city, as we read our Bible, but he gives it to him as a gift of guilt, basically, because he wants peace, because Jonathan has revealed what? That he is a very powerful fighter, and his army are very, very capable. And so he's already having trouble up here, so he doesn't want any more down here, so he quells the whole situation. And so he gives him Ekron. But what that means for the Jewish people at this point in time is that their area, which they're actually controlling, is now expanded. They've now taken coastal Jaffa, Ashdod, and now on the plains they've taken Ekron. So before then they didn't have any passage of control on the coast. And so for the Jewish people who are trying to recover their nation, this is an important step for them, because they now have access to the Mediterranean Sea. Now at the same time, the people of Ashdod or Azotus, they weren't happy with Jonathan, and they take their complaint to Ptolemy VI of Egypt, who has arrived in the region to take control of the Seleucid Empire. And so Ptolemy comes up, and he's up here towards Gaza. And the reason he's come here is because he has designs on taking over all this area which was currently under Seleucid control. Now you may or may not remember, but he actually married his daughter Cleopatra Thea to the Seleucid ruler in order to have a treaty of peace and be able to control outcomes. But this fellow, Alexander, he is classed as a debaucherous man, and he does appalling things. And so Ptolemy VI is unhappy with him as a son-in-law and sees him unfit to rule. And so he wants him gone. And so if he wants him gone, who does he want to replace him? Himself. Because they all still have designs on regrowing the original Greek Empire, and that they would actually be the ruler. And so they recount the destruction. So these people who had suffered under Jonathan, who had actually participated in fighting against the Jews, they recount the destruction and the temple dedicated to Dagon. But the king himself travels to Jaffa and he meets with Jonathan. And now the two men actually support opposing rulers. They're actually on the different sides of the fence, but they come to a peaceful agreement. Why? Because the king doesn't actually want any conflict. He's not looking to have a fight with Jonathan, and he's also wary of Jonathan because he's so powerful with his army. He's earned a reputation to be feared. And so what we see now is that the Jewish people are having a part to play in international politics, where they're recognised by other nations as a substantial force. This is quite extraordinary. You think he's only the second son of the person who stood up as one person against the whole Greek Empire. And so we have to see in this that when a person stands for God and with God, that God will stand with them and things will actually change. And so this is the background for which brings us up to where we are today. Now, after Alexander becomes the Seleucid king, he chooses to live this decadent and depraved life, and his debauchery is so repugnant he loses the support of his people, his allies, and his father-in-law Ptolemy VI of Egypt, who I just spoke about. Now, Ptolemy VI contacts Demetrius Nicator, who is the other contender, who is a son who came from the Greek island of Crete. And the reason he was put over there is because the Romans, sorry, not the Romans, that was earlier, was because his father was deposed by this Alexander Balis, and he basically fled and hid as a little boy on this island. Of course, he's grown up now, and he's saying, I'm the rightful heir to this throne, and so he wants to come back and contest the throne. So Ptolemy VI from the Egypt, he sees this as if he forms an alliance with this young boy, then he can have an ally to come and overthrow the ruler who is currently married to his daughter that he's very unhappy with. And so in the book of Maccabees, in 1 Maccabees chapter 11 verses 9 to 10, it says, this is the king of Egypt speaking, "Come, let us enter into a covenant with one another. I will give you my daughter, Alexander's wife, in marriage, and you will reign over your father's kingdom. For I regret giving him my daughter, since he tried to kill me." And so earlier in the piece, they'd been in a battle and he'd tried to kill him. So the interesting thing here, or probably not so interesting, is the fact that the daughter is just a pawn in reality. She's a princess and she's married to the king, but her sum total of worth is actually being handed out as a piece of treaty contract. Marry my daughter and we have peace between us. And so we find here that she's already been married off once. King's not happy, so he says, "Come back to me, daughter. I'm going to hand you out now to somebody else." I don't know about you, but I don't think I'd like to be his daughter very much. So Ptolemy VI of Egypt divorces his daughter, Cleopatra Thea, from Alexander I and remarries her to Demetrius II in 148 BC. He has plans to kill Alexander I and take the Seleucid Empire for himself. And this is what he doesn't disclose. So he forms an alliance with Demetrius Nicator to ensure his daughter remains queen in the interim. So he's expectant that he's going to overcome the other fellow and his daughter will continue on as the queen of the Seleucid Empire. So he'll maintain his hooks on this empire. So Demetrius Nicator sails home from Crete where he has hid since a little boy because his father, the former Seleucid king Demetrius Soter, was killed. But whilst he's on his way, Ptolemy VI travels north with his army and conquers most of Syria because Alexander I is in Cilicia quelling an uprising. And so on this map, we see here, this arrow that I've put up here, Alexander Balas has left the capital of the Seleucid Empire and he's up here quelling a battle. And so the Egyptian king, he's formed an alliance or an agreement not to fight with Jonathan of the Maccabees, and he's just passed straight through all the way up the coast. And as he goes up the coast, his army is so great and the army of the Seleucid Empire is actually absent that everyone says, "Okay, you win." And he manages to go all the way through to Seleucia on the coast and then through to Antioch, the capital. And so whilst this boy is on his way from Crete over here on the boat, he's actually gone up and taken over the place anyway. Okay, so we can see this shift in power that's happening. So in 145 BC, Alexander hears this news and he turns around and engages in battle against what are Egyptian and Cretan mercenaries near the Seleucid capital of Antioch. Supplied by Ptolemy VI and Demetrius II, Alexander is defeated and he flees south only to be killed, and this is from the book of Maccabees, by an Arab by the name of Zabdiel. And he's a Nabatean prince who's seeking to stay on good terms with Egypt. And so the journey that he would have gone on is over here on this side, is what's known as the King's Highway. Nabatea is over here. And so he would have come down all the way down here. He was running when he got beat. He ran all the way down here on the other side of the Jordan River, avoided Jonathan Maccabee and the rest, down the side of the Dead Sea, on his way down into what's today's Jordan. And on the way, he gets met by this Nabatean prince, who is an Arab, and his name is Zabdiel, and he comes to his end. What it says is that, unfortunately, when this fellow escaped, Ptolemy VI in this battle is actually wounded, the king, and he actually dies 3 days later. But what happens is that in the interim, this Zabdiel thought it'd be a good idea to take the head of Alexander I and to sever it from his body, and he sends it to the king of Egypt to say, "Hey, look, I'm your friend. I've sent you the head of your enemy." But of course, the head arrives, and Ptolemy VI is already dead, so it was a wasted enterprise. However, Alexander I, who was seen as a debaucherous person, is no longer a threat in the story. Okay, so as a consequence of this, Demetrius, who's come over from Crete, then becomes the ruler of the Seleucid Empire with Cleopatra Thea, the daughter of the Pharaoh, by his side. Now, as leader and high priest of Judea, Jonathan Maccabee has no commitment or loyalty to the new Seleucid king. So this is the thing, we're recounting history, but we're always looking in context of what's happening for the Lord's people. And he doesn't know him, he doesn't have any loyalty to him, he doesn't have any commitment to him. So he sees this as an opportunity to oust the Seleucids who control the Acra in Jerusalem. So as I said, they're in semi-autonomous rule. I'll just change this map over. They're in semi-autonomous rule. The previous week I put up all of these blue spots here all over the map. And these are actually all fortresses that were actually built by the Seleucid Empire as garrisons to hold their soldiers to control the land. In Jerusalem itself, there is what's called an Acra, or a citadel, or a fortress, and there was a garrison of soldiers left there to control the people at the end of the day. And so what happens is Jonathan Maccabeus is very keen to have these people removed. And so he sees this as an opportunity to do that. So he lays siege to the Acra next to the Temple of Jerusalem, but Demetrius is informed of his actions by the Hellenic Jews who are still amongst his own society. So Demetrius is enraged and he decides to bring his army down to Ptolemais and orders Jonathan to meet him. So Ptolemais is located here, and it's actually called Acre today, or it's called Acre, A-C-R-E, in the ancient times, but it was renamed after the Ptolemaic ruler of the empire. And so this line depicts Jonathan. He's going to go up here to meet him, and Demetrius is going to come down and meet him at this particular location. So basically between where both of them are ruling from. So Jonathan goes to the king with his elders and priests without stopping the siege though. So he doesn't stop, he tells them to keep going, and he heads off for the meeting. He takes gifts with him, and he found favour and calmed the Seleucid king down. Once Demetrius II had confirmed Jonathan's office as high priest, he asked the Seleucid king to exempt Judea from taxes and give 3 what are called toparchies, which are small districts that consist of a few towns or a few cities, from Samaria. So in other words, he's saying, I'll back off if you give me some more control of the territory that is ours that we don't currently control. And so to do this, and don't forget, he said no more taxes. And so to do this, he promises the king 300 talents, which is a lot of money in those days, a significant and large gift. The king responds and writes a letter to Jonathan, and this portion is recorded in the book of Maccabees, in 1 Maccabees chapter 11, verses 33 to 36, and it explains the outcome. It reads, "To the nation of the Jews, our friends, and who did what is right towards us, we have decided to do good because of their goodwill to us. We have established the borders of Judea for them and the 3 provinces of Ephraim, Lydda, and Rathamim. They were added to Judea from Samaria, as well as the areas bordering them. All who offer sacrifices in Jerusalem we have released from the royal taxes which the king received from them each year, from the harvest of the earth and the fruit of the vines," because of course these are part of how they pay their tax. "Any other payments due to us from now on from the tithes, the salt pits and the crown taxes." Salt pits makes sense, right? The Dead Sea's there, they're harvesting salt all the time as they do today. "From all these we grant release. None of these provisions will be cancelled from now on for all time." And so Jonathan managed to extract something that hasn't happened for some time now, and that's the freedom of not having to pay taxes to the empire that oversees them, and to be able to continue with their worship of the God of Israel. And in this case, he actually agrees to grant him some more territory. So after Demetrius II saw there was peace in the land, he dismissed his troops and returned to the Seleucid capital with the exception of his Cretan mercenaries. Jonathan lifted the siege of the Acra in return and left it in Seleucid hands. So in other words, they're still present. Although still under semi-autonomous rule, the borders under Judean control had now expanded. Now those three names that I gave you, they're the ancient names at the time, but the names that they're actually known under, this is one location, Lod. This is another location, Ramathaim Zophim, and the other one's known as Mount Ephraim. Now Mount Ephraim is actually the same mountain as Mount Ebal, which is one of the two mountains they sat on when they first divided up the land for the inheritance under the time of Joshua. So this green area represents the portion of land that was under control up until then. And as a consequence of this deal that's just been done, this portion of land up here has now been added to their territory. So it was quite a good negotiation that Jonathan did. And so this is the state of play at this point in time. So Demetrius II, however, is not a popular king, and the people of Syria have little admiration for what they see as a youth who gains power with the help of mercenaries from Egypt and Crete. The people in the capital city of Antioch, who were disillusioned with the former ruler Alexander, preferred Ptolemy VI to take the throne. So they were hoping that he would actually continue on, but of course he was killed in the battle. But he was adamant that Demetrius II should be king, this is Ptolemy, because the unification of two Hellenistic states will alarm the Roman Republic. So we see in the background the Roman Republic's always watching what's going on, and they don't want to cause a conflict with a growing empire in the background. And so, as it turns out, it can't happen anyway because the king of Egypt was killed in the battle. And so new problems begin to occur in Antioch when these Cretan mercenaries, it's interesting the word Cretan, because we use the word Cretan today as a person that's perhaps not very intelligent. If we pronounce the word in this way, we're talking about people from Crete. They were the Cretan or the Cretan mercenaries. But they begin to loot and raid the local population. They're not from there, and they're not nice people, and so they decide that they're just going to go and do what they like and take what they want. And they cause a big problem. Why? Because they're aligned with the current king who brought them there. And so the people now see these mercenaries as people who are aligned to this king, and so they're not happy, and so what do they want to do? They've just got a new ruler and they want to revolt again. They're not going to put up with this. Now the Jews that were living there apparently were horribly oppressed during this time, and the new king Demetrius failed to take control of the situation. So the people of Antioch rebel and terrible massacres follow. Now whilst this is happening, a Seleucid general called Deodotus Trifon, and I'll just put up a picture here. So this is a coin with him minted on the coin, so you can actually see what he actually looks like. So this is his name, Deodotus Trifon. So this fellow is a general, and he's a former supporter of the previous ruler Alexander I. And he hears how much the soldiers hate Demetrius II, so he approaches an Arab called Imalki, who is rearing Antiochus, the 3-year-old son of the now dead king. So he had a son, he's only 3 years old, and so strategy comes into play. He decides that he's going to find this boy and pull him into the play as the rightful heir to the throne. And so Deodotus seeks custody to promote his former king's son's claim to the throne. Keep in mind he's only 3 years old, so he's pretty desperate. So at the same time as these events transpire, peace has not returned to Judea because the soldiers in the Acra at Jerusalem and in the fortress cities in the land have actually been fighting against the Jews. So Jonathan sends a request to have them removed, and the Seleucid king promises to withdraw his garrison from Jerusalem. But to do this, he asked Jonathan to send troops to protect him in Antioch because the people aren't happy with him. So he's now asking him for a favour in order to remove the troops from Jonathan's land. What's Jonathan's priority here, do you think?
The king.
The king? He wants to help the king because he wants people out of his own territory. Normally he probably wouldn't have a bar of him, but because of the circumstances, he's got nothing to lose. And so what does he do? He agrees to the request. And this again is explained what happens in the book of Maccabees. Now, desperate for peace, as I said, Jonathan agrees, and he sends 3,000 men to protect the Seleucid king against his own people. In the book of Maccabees, it explains, "Then the men from the city gathered within the city, 120,000 of them." You may recall in the previous lesson I told you that Antioch, which is the capital of the Seleucid Empire, is now the third largest city in the world. And so it's a high population. You may also recall that the Jews that used to live by the Euphrates River were moved across to Antioch because Babylon was crumbling. And so the society that had been, the remnant that had been left over from the time of Babylonian exile, the king was a good king at that time, and he said, hey, let's move you from there, we'll put you into our new city and we'll take care of you. So it had a large Jewish population, and it had an even larger total population. So he says, then the men from the city gathered within the city, 120,000 of them, and they wanted to kill the king. But the king fled into the palace, and those from the city seized the streets of the city, and they began to fight. So the king summoned the Jews for help, and they all rallied around him and dispersed throughout the city. On that day, they killed about 100,000 men. 3,000 Jewish soldiers killed 100,000 men. So it sort of tells you about why they're asking Jonathan for his army, because they're clearly very, very good at what they do. And these figures are extraordinary. So they set the city on fire, took many spoils on that day, and rescued the king. So they're still Jews, they still don't like these people, so they decide that they're going to do a bit of damage, and they burn and plunder at the same time. When the men of the city realised the Jews had gained control of the city at will, they lost their courage and called out to the king with this request: restore the peace and make the Jews quit fighting us and the city. So they threw down their weapons and made peace. Then the Jews were honoured before the king and before all those in his kingdom. After this, they returned to Jerusalem with many spoils. And so the outcome of Jonathan sending his men, it was 100,000 people died, which are part of the population who are basically their enemies. They set fire to a lot of their city. They took spoils from it, and then they get thanked and honoured for it and go home. So Jonathan's strategy is pretty good. So after being rescued by Jonathan's army, Demetrius proves to be both dishonourable and breaks his word. And he does not keep his promise to remove the garrisons from throughout the land of Judea. So in 143 BC, this general called Deodotus Trifon comes forward with the young boy Antiochus and crowns him king. The troops who hate Demetrius gather around the child king, and in a battle the capital of Antioch is seized, and Demetrius II takes flight. Again, in 1 Maccabees chapter 11 verses 57 to 59 explains what happens. It says, so Antiochus the younger, they call him the younger, he's only 3 years old, wrote to Jonathan. So we clearly know that Deodotus is doing the writing and controlling everything, right? Saying, I confirm you in the high priesthood, set you over the 4 provinces, because they've been given those 3 other areas. They classed, this is a language thing, because we look at a province different today to what they did then. So every little area is still called a province no matter what size it is. So set you over the 4 provinces, and you will be one of the king's friends. He also sent him gold cups to serve him at table, and gave him authority to drink from these, to dress in purple, and to wear a golden buckle. So again, the purple is the sign of authority to rule. And he gave him a golden buckle just to make him look nice. He then established Simon his brother as general from the ladder of Tyre to the boundary of Egypt. And so here we hear about his brother being assigned a position of authority to actually command by the Seleucid king. And this is a change of pace, because up to now, Simon has always fulfilled duties for his brother John. Okay, nothing bad's going to happen, but the thing is that a second Maccabee brother now has been given authorised power within the land. But take notice here, it says, as a general from the ladder of Tyre to the boundary of Egypt. And so I have a picture here. This is a schematic drawing done many, many years ago before modern times. And this actually shows you what's called the ladder of Tyre. So the ladder, the word ladder, is actually referencing the steps that go up here. You can see the coastline here is quite rugged and steep where the water comes. And so this is obviously a pathway which is the only way through. If you look along the distance, you can actually see some camels here and up here and across here. So this path is going up and all the way across the face of this rock right along the edge of the coast. Does anyone know what the significance of the ladder of Tyre is? It's very biblical, if you don't know. It might sound a bit obtuse. The ladder of Tyre is actually the northern boundary of the territories that the Lord gave for the promised land. That is the place. And so the significance of this, he says he established Simon, his brother's general, from the ladder of Tyre, the northern boundary of the land, to the boundary of Egypt, the southern boundary of the land, which means now Jonathan's brother is patrolling or in control of the whole coast of the promised land itself. And so what we're seeing again is a significant step forwards to return to control of the land back to the former Israelites who are now Jews. So Hasmonean rule in Judea under Jonathan is confirmed because he agrees to help. Demetrius had also offered the same terms, but Jonathan, having been burnt once before by him, switches his support to the new king Antiochus VI Dionysius, which is this little boy, who functions with Deodotus as his co-regent. Clearly he is, because this boy is 3 years old. So as the rights of Jonathan are established, his brother Simon is also appointed as strategos, or civil governor of the coast from the ladder of Tyre to the frontier of Egypt. And again, these are the boundaries that are recognised as the natural borders of the promised land. So this is very significant. Now Demetrius II is unable to retake the capital of Antioch, and so he moves to the east and establishes himself in the Seleucia, which is in the Babylonian territories. And Seleucia was the new city that was originally being built as a new capital a little bit north of Babylon. But of course they decided to move the capital closer to the centre of where the action was. So he goes to this former startup capital. So Deodotus has his own plans for rule and intends to use Antiochus VI, the boy, for his own purposes. But the outcome sees the Seleucid Empire split between the legitimate heir and the infringer in Antioch. Despite the politics and struggle for power, Jonathan and Simon have the entire army of Syria now as their allies, and they seek to end opposition to the rule of the new king and his regent. Ashkelon on the southern coast submitted willingly, but Gaza was taken by force. Let me just go back. And so there's these locations. So here's Ashkelon, here's Gaza. Now this stream here, it's called the Bethel River, is actually the natural boundary for the south of the land of Israel. It is actually the current border as well. It's called the River of Egypt sometimes as well. So this is the place that he's talking about. So Ashkelon still wasn't under their control at this point in time. So Jonathan and his army said they're allied. And so Ashkelon on the southern coast submits willingly when they realise that all of these people are now coming together and they can't stand against them. But Gaza had to be taken by force. Forces entered at a place called Kadesh in the Galilee, which is up over on this side here. It's not marked on the map, but it's up over on this side. So forces came in from the other side, so this king that's on to the east, to oust Jonathan from office, but Jonathan overpowered them to the north in a battle at a place called Hazor. And so Hazor is right here. Okay. Simon, at the same time, to the south of Bethlehem at Beth-zur, where we had a battle we talked about a couple of weeks ago, his brother overcame the fortress full of supporters of Demetrius II. So basically they're going around mopping up any resistance that's left in the land that's aligned to the former king. So this show of strength by Jonathan and his army, however, is too much for Deodotus, the regent of this little boy. He's obviously worried about the power that he has, and he sees him as a threat. So he decides that he's going to deceive him and capture him. So taking an army with him to Judea, he invites Jonathan to Scythopolis. So Scythopolis, and it's still got this name there when you visit today. It's also called Bet Shean. So this is the crossroads here where the Jezreel Valley comes across from the coast. So all the trade and the troops move in. You go across the Jordan River, up onto the plateau, and then you get the highway which would go up to northern Mesopotamia or down to Arabia the other way. So this is a major junction here. But when the Greeks came to rule it, they started to create Greek cities. And so Bet Shean was changed to the name of Scythopolis, and some other cities were built, which we mentioned before, that 5 of the cities were built during the time of the Seleucid rule. When we get to the New Testament, we have what they call the Decapolis, right, which means the 10 cities. And so this is one of those 10 cities that were built during the time of Greek rule. So he goes there to meet with Jonathan, and Jonathan arrives with a small party of 40,000 men. So Jonathan doesn't trust in anyone. So Deodotus feigns his purpose and declares he only came for peaceful talks. Remember, he brought an army with him, but it was much smaller. And so he only came for peaceful talks, so he convinces Jonathan to send his army home. Jonathan unfortunately believes him, but he keeps 1,000 men with him just in case. And what happens? They're actually killed, and he's taken prisoner. So in other words, whilst he's actually with this regent, the army outside take care of all of his people, and they're all killed. And so Jonathan finds himself incarcerated under this Deodotus. So despite all that has happened, Deodotus is still a Seleucid co-regent. He used the Jews to secure his kingdom. So this is his point of view. He gave them authority and he gave them power, and he used them to wipe out all those people who were coming against them on the basis that he was in a treaty or an alliance with him. He says that he's going to give him the rule over his own territory. He's going to remove the fortresses and the garrisons, but of course it's all a sham. So he used this as a ploy to get Jonathan's trust. He goes down to meet him, he sends Jonathan's army away, and then he kills the remnant of the army who remains with Jonathan. So he's a Seleucid co-regent, and he uses the Jews to secure his kingdom, because that's how he sees it, because his intentions are, what do you think? He's got a 3-year-old boy who he's crowned as the king. What's his real intention? He's going to bump off this boy and take control for himself. So that's his heart behind this. History's great, isn't it? You just keep following along. It's just a litany of one after another who's going to bump off the heir or the ruler or whatever. It just never stops, one after another. I don't know in the duration of this course how many people we've lost, but it's probably in the thousands by now. So he grew wary, though, of Jonathan, because his status in the region as a powerful force had actually been growing. So he takes their leader as prisoner, and he uses this to intimidate the Jews, but he will not be successful. Deodotus is confronted by Simon Thassi, as he's known, and this is the new Jewish leader. This, of course, is Jonathan's brother, who was given the authority to also roam the land with his troops and to govern. So to avoid fighting, Deodotus demands 100 talents and the 2 sons of his brother Jonathan as hostages. Deodotus then promises to release Jonathan if Simon complies, and even though Simon doesn't trust Deodotus, with good reason, he complies anyway. Why? Because he doesn't want his brother to die. And so this manipulative practice, he sees him getting what he wants. But as before, Deodotus doesn't honour his agreement and fails to release Jonathan. Frustrated and angry, Simon blocks every move he makes, but a price was paid for this, and Jonathan was executed at a place called Bascama, east of the Jordan River. And so it is that Jonathan Appius, the first governor and high priest of a semi-independent Judea, met his end, struggling for the freedom of his people. So that brings us to the end of tonight's lesson. Keep in mind that the descendant that we're following in the genealogy of Jesus, Matthan, is living through all of this. There is armies and threats coming and going. There is the change of leadership happening, and they're very, very reliant on the Maccabees and their army to protect them. And so each time one of these events happen, you can imagine there would be a ripple passing through their society, wondering what was going to happen next. Are they safe? Are they secure? Because the reality is, because the Seleucid leaders kept lying, the garrisons ended up staying in the land with soldiers all the time. And so the people were told, you can govern your own people, but our army's going to be present at all times. And so this is the state of play at the end of this. Okay, so this brings us to the end for this lesson. The next lesson we're going to continue on with Simon, the brother of Jonathan, and we're going to go through to the end of the journey for Matthan, and we then move to Jacob. Who's Jacob?
Grandfather.
Very good. So Jacob isn't Israel, he is the grandfather of Jesus. So you can see we're getting very close to the time of Jesus coming now. So the next lesson, as I said, we'll follow this journey through, and the following lesson, when we go into the time of Jacob, the Greeks are still in control, but things start to ramp up because we enter into the period of time where they actually claim to be kings, the rulers, and we have a separation of society between the poor and the wealthy, and this is when we start to hear about the formation of the Sadducees and the Pharisees. And so this is what we're going to be covering in the next two lessons.
But you